views and opinions expressed by the guest in this episode are solely their own and do not represent the position of Campaign Against Antisemitism, nor does Campaign Against Antisemitism guarantee the accuracy of the guest statements. My guest today is Shabbos Kestenbaum, a religion and public policy graduate student from Harvard University. Since the 7th of October Hamas atrocities, Shabbos has been embroiled in a long public battle with Harvard, which has resulted in him suing them for failing to combat anti-Semitism, describing the school as a bastion of rampant anti-Jewish hatred and harassment. Shabbos, thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think let's just dive right in. I think a lot of people hear that you're suing Harvard and they're going to be like, whoa. How did you come to that decision and what was the final straw for you?
Sure. Well, we sued Harvard not because we wanted to, but because we felt like we had to. And I can think of no more damning indictment on the state of higher education in the United States, and broadly speaking, higher education, when it comes to the supposed elite universities, where in order to receive equity, equality, or justice, we have to resort to a court of law because we have zero confidence that Harvard will do the right thing, and therefore we are asking the judge to do Harvard's job for them. So we filed the lawsuit in mid to late January after spending roughly 3 months trying to figure out solutions, trying to work with the administration, trying to alleviate some of the burdens, hardships, and challenges that too many Jewish students at the university were facing. But the reality was Harvard was either unable or clearly at this point unwilling to do anything to fix the problem. The problem, of course, that they have created. So the lawsuit basically relies on three arguments, but the main one is a provision of the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s called Title VI. And Title VI prohibits any recipient of federal dollars from discrimination based on race or national origin. And there's also one other component that I'm forgetting of, but we'll skip that for now. And under the Trump administration, he reclassified the definition of Judaism. So Judaism is no longer a religion, but it is also now an ethnicity. And therefore, for the very first time, we have a credible lawsuit where we could say, well, if we're an ethnicity, then we fall under Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on national origin. So that is essentially our argument, that Harvard is in violation of its federal obligations under the law. I'm part of a WhatsApp group of dozens of Jewish students across the country who are filing similar lawsuits at their universities, almost exclusively under the Title VI provision. And in terms of your question of what was the straw that broke the camel's back, it wasn't one specific incident, but it was a pattern of discrimination, a pattern of wrongdoing. And I can give you a whole laundry list of incidents. I can point to different dates and different events that created this type of hostility. But the reality was, as we say in our lawsuit, anti-Semitism at Harvard was and is pervasive and systemic. And after October 7th, really on the night of October 7th, it became inescapable. It was always there, but it was this genteel anti-Semitism that was really swept under the rug, but it became out in the open and naked in a really public way that we've never seen before.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, many people around not just the States, but in the United Kingdom will resonate with that. You know, we've spoken to a lot of students over here who are describing similar things that you're describing. Let's go right back to the beginning. At Harvard, on the morning of October 8th, 34 student organizations said that they signed a statement that they said it held Israel, quote, solely responsible for Hamas's brutal and psychotic anti-Semitic terrorism. Can you tell us what you saw happening at Harvard immediately in the days that following and what your reaction to that was?
Well, so while it's true that the statement itself wasn't published until the morning of October 8th, it was being written on the night of October 7th. So I was in the Hillel and the Chabad, which are the two institutions of Jewish life on campus, to celebrate the Jewish joyous holiday of Simchas Torah. And as we are celebrating, the crowd begins to thin out and people's faces start turning red and there are tears. Then there are all these rumors. There was a stabbing, there was a bombing, there was a kidnapping. I would assume your listeners are aware of this, but the reality of having a Jewish state in the 21st century is yes, there's terrorism, but we sort of move on. But these rumors continue to persist. and they were strengthened as the hours went on. So even though I'm a religious Jew, I've never used my phone before on the Sabbath. That's exactly what I did for the very first time. I used my phone to contact my loved ones. I have 3 siblings, 2 in-laws, a nephew, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and I contacted them to make sure that they were okay. As I was doing this, as dozens of Jewish students at Harvard and thousands of Jewish students across the country were doing this, we had, as you said, 34 student groups at Harvard on the night of October 7th jump out of their beds, some were still in their pajamas, to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. In fact, the opening line of the statement was, "We hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all ongoing violence in the Middle East." So that was the reaction of our friends or former friends, of our classmates, and in some cases our professors. And there are many moments in the last couple of months that I will never be able to forgive and forget. And one of them is the night of October 7th, the behaviors and the actions of those who we trusted, of those who we were friends with, of those who we considered allies. They were adamant that their recourse was to blame Jews as we were trying to figure out if our loved ones and if our family were alive or not. So there's this great line by MLK, "We will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Well, we in the Jewish community would be fortunate if we only had silence, but we had animated enthusiasm for what was happening. And just a couple days later, there was a protest at Harvard, about 1,000 professors and students. And the student gets up, one of the speakers, and says, "Hamas is not a terrorist organization. They will be looked down as freedom fighters. And who are we to condemn the resistance?" And he's received with thunderous applause. And again, these are students that I know, classmates that I know, and professors. In some cases, professors I sat in class with and learned from. So it was deeply unsettling and incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, to say the least. I mean, it's not just those students and professors who have let you down. You've also bafflingly been let down by Harvard's anti-Semitism task force. So in February, you and other Jewish students testified before Congress about anti-Semitism on college campuses. You told members of the House of Education and Workforce Committee that you'd written to Harvard's anti-Semitism task force more than 40 times about the hate that you had seen on campus, but you never received a reply. That is shocking. What does that say about Harvard's anti-Semitism task force?
The Harvard Anti-Semitism Task Force is the largest collection of intellectually challenged individuals I've ever met in my life. These individuals are so morally bankrupt that they make any other institution look competent by default. So the Anti-Semitism Task Force today is actually a second iteration of a previously failed task force. So Claudine Gay, the plagiarist in chief, who I'm sure we'll talk about later, one of the very, very not dumb things she did was decide that she was going to organize an advisory group on anti-Semitism, not a task force, an advisory group. And the advisory group was not given a clear mandate, was not given the clear backing of the university. In fact, Congress, the United States Congress, really through the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, released a damning report on the behind the scenes of this advisory group and the level of disorder, to put it mildly, that they were encountering. And the advisory group was so remarkably useless that its most respected member and my personal professor, Rabbi David Wolpe, resigned, essentially citing how ineffective and useless it was. So after the plagiarist Claudine Gay was fired, I mean, she'll say she resigned, but really the board asked her to leave, Harvard said, "Okay, the advisory group's work is now done." Oh, okay, they figured out how to combat anti-Semitism. Great. So they said, what they're now going to do is take the findings of the advisory group and then use a new task force called the Anti-Semitism Task Force to influence their policies. So me being the annoying Jew I was, I said, okay, well, if they are sending their findings to the task force, what are their findings? Can you tell us? And Harvard said, nope, we can't tell you. It's private. Number one, there are no findings because the advisory group didn't do anything. And two, the fact that there is now this new task force, which has the exact same unclear mandate, really underscores how Harvard is just so unable or unwilling to do anything. The new task force was set up, and the co-chair was a woman by the name of Rafaela Sadoun, a professor at the business school, and she resigns after like a week, basically citing what David Wolpe cited, how ineffective and useless it was. It was just a tool for the university, pretend that they were doing something. So Harvard, in all of its brilliance, decided they were going to appoint a new co-chair by the name of Derek Penslar. Derek Penslar, besides signing a public statement calling Israel an apartheid regime that seeks to create a settler colonial state, besides doing that, he has repeatedly said on the record to major Jewish publications that anti-Semitism at Harvard is, quote, exaggerated. So Harvard decided in all of its brilliance that he was going to be the one to lead this task force. And so, as you pointed out, I emailed this task force more than 40 times on instances of anti-Semitism, asking for help, asking for resources. They didn't respond once. It was only when I went in front of the United States Congress and I said under oath on live TV that they hadn't responded, that 12 hours later I get a response saying, oh, we are just so concerned and thank you for telling us. They are so remarkably useless and ineffective, and they are pawns of the administration, whether they use it or whether they know it or not. And in fact, I can't talk about the details of our case and the inner workings too much, but right now Harvard is arguing in court that of course we take anti-Semitism so seriously because look at the task force we established. Task forces don't mean anything if there's no action behind it, if they don't respond to students, if there are no policy implementations. And we haven't seen any of that, which is why the task force is not worthy of respect. It's not worthy of the ink put on paper. So
you mentioned Claudine Gay there a moment ago. Famously, she was parodied by SNL for her anti-Semitism testimony, where she was asked whether Harvard condemns I think it was, does calling for genocide against Jews breach Harvard's policy against bullying, or something to that effect? And she responded along the lines of, "It depends on the context." As someone who is at Harvard, what was your reaction seeing that?
So when Elise Stefanik asked her, do the calls for genocide against Jewish people violate the school policy, and she said it depends on the context, number one, this is just a cool behind-the-scenes thing, Elise Stefanik was not expecting that answer. She was expecting her to say, yeah, of course. And then the follow-up, the real kicker, the real get-you-in-trouble question was going to be, well, okay, if that's true, then how come you've allowed students to call for an intifada? But she was really not expecting Claudine Gay to be that idiotic and say, oh, it depends, which is why if you watch the testimony again, Elise Stefanik says, this is a softball question, I will give you another chance. She really was trying to help Claudine Gay come up with the right answer, but Claudine Gay refused to get out of her own way. So in terms of that particular answer, look, she gave a series of terrible answers. I mean, the testimony itself was like 5-6 hours, and every single answer was more appalling than the next. You know, she was asked at point blank, can you guarantee the safety of incoming Jewish students? And she refused to give a simple yes or no answer. So in terms of that question in particular, number one, she's wrong. They very much do violate the school policies. It's very unclear what context she could possibly be referring to, unless, as she began to answer, unless it resorts to action. So unless people actually commit genocide against Jewish people, which obviously would violate school policy, let alone the law. But that answer was very validating and very affirming. Why? Because for months, I and other Jewish students were trying to showcase to the world just how bad it was. And people were thinking, we're exaggerating, we're being overtly sensitive, it can't be that bad. But then all of a sudden you have the president of the university saying on live TV that really, you know, Jews are treated qualitatively different, and you really could call for the genocide depending on the context. It was so affirming. We pointed to the camera and said, you see, we told you it was bad. And we have the president of the university admitting that we are treated differently. So it was a terrible answer that made no sense, that was morally bankrupt, but at the same time, it was the best possible answer because it affirmed what Jewish students had been saying for months, and now you couldn't pretend that we were wrong.
Let's jump to some of the anti-Israel encampments that have been spreading across not just the United States, but over here in the United Kingdom too. The anti-Israel encampment on Harvard actually ended in May after the university apparently struck a deal with those leading the protest. Can you tell us what happened here?
Yeah, so the encampment really worked. They basically got everything they were looking for. As a result of them packing up their foul-smelling tents and their open-air laundry, they will be able to meet with the Harvard Management Corporation, which oversees Harvard's $50 billion endowment, to talk about divesting from the Zionist state. They will be able to talk with senior Harvard faculty members as to whether or not There can be a Harvard Palestine Study Center. They will have all of their disciplinary actions revoked. So if you want to get things done, all you need to do is call for the ethnic genocide of a minority group. All you need to do is put on bright yellow safety vests and monitor a minority group on their way to class. Just record them, write down their movements. All you need to do is just depict the Jewish president with horns and a tail as a devil directly from Nazi propaganda in the 30s. They literally got their way. And in fact, it was quite telling that the end of the semester, all these morons from the encampment give this pseudo press conference, and they say, look what happens when we mobilize. Look what happens when we work together. We can defeat the university. Long live the Intifada. So, of course, the fall semester will be significantly worse because the university has placated and acquiesced to literally all of their demands. They have treated them like children and have tried to negotiate and gave them everything they wanted. So the encampments, I try to be very calm, cool, and collective. I try to make jokes. I always say we're suing Harvard, but we're having fun doing it. But there is one thing that always bothers me to no end, and bothering is put it mildly, but it is the treatment of Jewish students in respect to the encampments. That these encampments were happening outside of the building where the university president works, and it went on for 3 weeks, and he literally did nothing about it. We were harassed at all hours of the day. As I said, we were monitored. These safety marshals took out their phones and began recording us as we were walking for days on end. And they were met with no punishment. They were met with no condemnation. It's shocking that this was allowed to continue for more than 2 hours. But this is the reality of being Jewish at Harvard. And I will never be able to forgive and forget the behavior and actions of those who are ostensibly in charge of supporting and protecting us. Just a failure at every single level.
Well, that sort of leads me on to asking you about your personal safety. You've been quite outspoken in detailing the harassment that you have received personally. So firstly, how have you been holding up and are you okay? And second, can you sort of tell us what's been going on with you?
Sure. Well, I'm too angry to really focus on my mental health, but what I will say is I had private armed security outside my house for a week after a staff member taunted me with a machete and then challenged me to debate him as to whether Jews were involved in 9/11. There was a guy with a gun who followed me to Friday night prayers to make sure that I was okay. I received countless death threats online from the far right and the far left. I mean, at this point, I'm sort of numb to it. I don't particularly care anymore. The only thing that really bothers me is when I get undeserved criticism from within my community, from within the Jewish community. That hurts. That's deeply hurtful. It's deeply offensive. It's deeply personal. That's what really bothers me. But in terms of my physical safety, I always say if someone wants to throw a rock through my window, yeah, it'll be annoying to clean up the glass, but ultimately that's not on me. That's not my problem. That's on the assailant. It's for him to explain to a court of law, to the court of public opinion, to his family, why it is that he has such naked, unvarnished Jew hatred. So if someone wants to do it, I'm not going to stop them. I have other things to worry about, and I'm too busy. But that's on them. I've done nothing wrong. I have nothing to apologize for. And this is true for Jewish students across the board. They have done nothing wrong. They're being victimized by a system that clearly does not care about them or their safety.
I mean, it's pretty clear by now that there is a very real problem within academia. Why do you think that Israel, much more so than any other country or region on earth, is so obsessed over within academia?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always say that if you spent the last 2-3 years at Harvard, you would not know that China exists. You would not know that South Africa exists because there are really only 2 countries that exist, and that's Israel and Palestine. Part of it, and this will sound like a tired trope, but it's true. Part of it is the diversity, equity, inclusion mentality, which I think in the UK is called positive discrimination, or at least it was. My parents are from the UK. My mom went to, I think, Leeds, but I could be wrong, and it was called positive discrimination, which really creates this binary illusion, a binary ideology where all peoples can be classified into 2 groups, the oppressor or the oppressed, and Jews have this misfortune of being mischaracterized as white. So whether it was 40 babies beheaded on October 7th or 40,000 babies beheaded on October 7th, it really doesn't matter because, as my classmates will tell you, resistance is justified when people are occupied. And in fact, Harvard University was the first university in the world, well, I shouldn't say university, Harvard Chabad did this, that screened the 45-minute Hamas video, the attacks that they carried out on October 7th. And we had a couple hundred people who showed up, but the overwhelming majority were Jewish people, people like me. You're not going to move or animate people. You're not going to emotionally convince them by showing them the most grotesque images and videos that you can possibly conceive of. It's just not going to animate people because, again, it all falls through the prism of the oppressor mentality. And the oppressor can do no right, and the oppressed can do no wrong. So I think that's part of where we get the situation where we are today. But another part of it is Israel really goes against this DEI mantra, where if you're a victim, you can never be successful, and you're very much a character at the mercy of this oppressive system. Well, Jews historically have been victims. We've been persecuted and discriminated, and of course had our own genocide, the largest in human history. But at the same time, we are remarkably successful. We were able, just 3 years after the gas chambers, to build a state of our own. We are pretty dominant in major industries, at least in the United States. So we really blow up the whole DEI model in a way that other minority groups really can't or don't. And because of that uneasy tension, because of that inability to follow this ideology, there's going to be innately a sense of demonization and degradation as it pertains to the Jewish people and the Jewish state.
You recently gave a rousing speech at the Republican National Convention recently, in which you spoke proudly about being an Orthodox Jew. How did it feel to be up there?
It was very empowering. And if I always say, if the Democrats want me to talk about our bipartisan message and common sense policies, I would be more than honored to do so. It was very surreal. I think what was most important and most impactful was not the speech itself, but a little behind the scenes. I was backstage right before my speech, and I was in a small room with Lee Zeldin, who was the former Republican nominee for governor in New York, and Omer Nutra's parents. Of course, Omer Nutra is the American Jewish hostage still being held in Gaza, and his parents have been outspoken about bringing him home. And I was backstage with them. And it was incredibly emotional. And I went up to them and said, there's nothing I could say. I don't even know what to say. All I can add is that you have been given me on an individual level such inspiration and such courage to continue my fight. So all I can say is thank you. And of course, I start tearing up and they start tearing up. And I have to leave the room because I'm about to give a speech. And they actually put makeup on me, which is a little odd. I couldn't ruin the makeup. But that was way more impactful than any speech and any meeting I had prior or since. That really hit home that this is why we're doing what we're doing. And these are people's lives at stake. And what a unbelievable honor and privilege that I've been given a platform to spread that message. So it was incredibly moving.
That's a lovely insight. Let me ask you a question now that I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Well, if they're Jewish, it's easier because this is your fight anyways. Whether you realize it or not, you are part of this story. And the next chapter in Jewish history is currently being written. And you very much want to be an author of that chapter. You don't want to be someone who is on the sidelines. And if you're not Jewish, the best thing you could do is reach out. We would love to have you for a Shabbat Friday night meal. We would love to dispel the myths, the rumors, and the stereotypes that you may have been hearing. We would love to pray for you, to pray with you. I was just at the Christians United for Israel conference, which is the largest pro-Israel conference, I think, in the world, but definitely in the United States. Millions and millions of Bible-believing Christians who are appalled at the treatment of Jewish people on college campuses, who are appalled at the treatment of the Jewish state on the political arena, who are appalled at the inability to secure the release of the hostages, all of these things. And I've never felt so supported and seen and welcomed. So for my non-Jewish allies, reach out, tell us you're with us, and we will reciprocate, I promise.
All right. Shabbos, before we wrap up, please remind the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
Sure. So I'm on social media, which I was definitely not before October 7th. I still don't totally know how to use Twitter, so if people can help, let me know. But yeah, my Instagram is half of my name, so Shabbos Kest. And my Twitter is Shabbos K, so a little shorter. And I post about my activities, post about our lawsuit. So you can definitely follow me on those platforms. In terms of what I will be doing for the next couple of months is basically this: speaking to any audience as possible, telling them, educating them, number one, about the situation and circumstances on the ground, but then also creating allies, working with Jewish and non-Jewish partners, working at the United States Congress to create legislation and enact policies that will alleviate many of these tensions and concerns. I will do whatever I can for as long as I can, wherever I can, to create change for the community I was brought up in and for the community I love. So if there are conferences, if there are conventions, if there are organizations that want to amplify the voices of Jewish students, we would be honored to do so. We will continue to be in this fight for as long as it takes. We're not going anywhere.
All right. Well, if people want you, they know how to get you now. Shabbos Kestenbaum, thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you. I appreciate it.